The Smolensk War was a conflict fought between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Russia. Hostilities began in October 1632 when Russian forces tried to capture the city of Smolensk. Small military engagements produced mixed results for both sides, but the surrender of the main Russian force in February 1634 led to the Treaty of Polyanovka. Russia accepted Polish-Lithuanian control over the Smolensk region, which lasted for another 20 years. Background: in 1632, Sigismund III Vasa, the King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, died. Although the Commonwealth nobility quickly elected Sigismund's son Vladislav IV Vasa as the new ruler of Poland's neighbors, expecting delays in the electoral process, tested the Commonwealth's perceived weakness. Swedish King Gustav II Adolf sent envoys to Russia and the Ottoman Empire to propose an alliance and war against the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth was not ready for war. In 1631, the Royal Army numbered barely 3,000 men. The Smolensk garrison was about 500 strong, and most garrisons in the border area were composed not of regular or mercenary soldiers but of 100 to 200 local volunteers, aware that Russia was preparing for war. In the spring of 1632, the Sejm increased the army by recruiting an additional 4,500 men. By mid-1632, the deputy voivode of Smolensk, Samuel Draki Sokolinski, had about 500 volunteers from Pospolite Rusyny and 2,500 regular army soldiers and Cossacks. In May, the Senate of Poland agreed to increase the size of the army, but Grand Lithuanian Hetman Lu Sapieha objected, arguing that the current forces were enough and that war was not likely. Nonetheless, the field Lithuanian Hetman Krzysztof Radziwiłł recruited an additional 2,000 soldiers. Russia, having recovered to a certain extent from the time of troubles, agreed with the assessment that the Commonwealth would be weakened by the death of its king, and unilaterally attacked without waiting for the Swedes and the Ottomans. Russia's aim was to gain control of Smolensk, which it had ceded to the Commonwealth in 1618 at the Truce of Julino, ending the last Russo-Polish War. Smolensk was the capital of the Commonwealth's Smolensk voivodeship, but it had often been contested, and it changed hands many times during the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries. A major supporter of the war was the Tsar's father, Patriarch Filaret, who represented the anti-Polish camp at court. Inspired by the Zemsky Sobor's call for vengeance and reclamation of lost lands, the Russian army sallied west. Hostilities. The Russian army that crossed the Lithuanian border in early October 1632 had been carefully prepared and was under the experienced command of Mikhail Borisovich Shine, who had previously defended Smolensk against the Poles during the 1609–1611 siege. Several towns and castles fell as the Russians advanced, and on the 28th of October 1632, Shine moved to begin the siege of Smolensk. Former Polish estimates of the size of the Russian forces varied from 25,000 through 30,000 to 34,500, with 160 artillery pieces. Recent research on 17th-century Russian archive documents showed that the size of the Russian army was 23,961. Compared to former Russian armies, Shane's army was significantly modernized. Dissatisfied with the traditional formations of musket-equipped infantry, the Russians looked to foreign officers to update the equipment and training of the troops based on the Western European model of regulars, dragoons, and reiters. 8 such regiments, totaling 14,000 to 17,000 men, comprised part of Shane's army. Siege of Smolensk. Commonwealth forces in Smolensk were composed of the Smolensk garrison, strengthened by the local nobility, which formed a Pospolite-Russian force of about 1,500 strong. The city's fortifications had also recently been improved with Italian-style bastions. Shine constructed lines of circumvallation around the fortress. Using tunnels and mines, his forces damaged a long section of the city wall and one of its towers. Russian heavy artillery, mostly of Western manufacture, reached Smolensk in December 1632, with even heavier guns arriving the following March. After a preliminary artillery bombardment, Shine ordered an assault, which was repulsed by the Polish defenders. Nonetheless, the siege was progressing. Smolensk's fortifications were being eroded, and the defenders were suffering heavy casualties and running out of supplies. By June 1633, some soldiers started to desert, and others talked of surrender. Despite these difficulties, the city, commanded by Deputy Voivode Samuel Draki Sokolinski, held out throughout 1633 while the Commonwealth, under its newly elected King Vladislav IV, organized a relief force. The same had been informed about the Russian invasion by the 30th of October 1632, and, starting in November, had discussed the possibility of relief. However, the process was delayed until the spring of 1633, when the Sejm officially sanctioned a declaration of war and authorized a large payment for the raising of a suitable force. The intended relief force would have an effective strength of about 21,500 men and would include 24 Karagius of winged hussars, 27 Karagius of light cavalry, also known as Cossack cavalry but not composed of Cossacks, 10 squadrons of raiders, 7 Lithuanian petty horse regiments, 7 large regiments of dragoons, until the 20 regiments of infantry. Over 10,000 of the infantry would be organized based on the Western model, previously not common in Commonwealth armies. Meanwhile, Field Hetman of Lithuania and Voivode of Vilnius, Krzysztof Radziwiłł, and Voivode Gosiewski established a camp about 30 kilometers from Smolensk, moving from Orsha to Barjo and later Krasna. By February 1633, they had amassed around 4,500 soldiers, including over 2,000 infantry, and were engaged in raiding the rear areas of the Russian besiegers to disrupt the logistics. Hetman Radziwiłł also managed to break through the Russian lines on several occasions, bringing about 1,000 soldiers and supplies into Smolensk to reinforce the fortress and raising the defenders' morale. By the summer of 1633, the relief force, led personally by the king and numbering about 25,000, arrived near Smolensk. They reached Orsha on the 17th of August 1633. By the first days of September, the main body of the relief forces approaching Smolensk numbered around 14,000. The Russian army, recently reinforced, numbered 25,000. Only when Cossack reinforcements led by Timish Orendrenko and numbering between 10,000 and 20,000 arrived on the 17th of September would the Commonwealth army gain numerical superiority. The Cossacks under Orendrenko and Marcin Kazanovsky would raid the Russian rear lines, freeing the Polish-Lithuanian units under Radziwiłł and Gosiewski to join the effort to break the siege. Władysław's brother, John II Casimir, commanded one of the regiments in the relief army. Another notable commander was the Field Crown Hetman, Marcin Kazanovsky. King Vladislav IV, a great supporter of the modernization of the Commonwealth army, proved to be a good tactician, and his innovations in the use of artillery and fortifications based on Western ideas greatly contributed to the eventual Polish-Lithuanian success. He had replaced the old arquebusiers with musketeers, and standardized the Commonwealth artillery, both to great effect. Commonwealth's cavalry, including the winged hussars, significantly restricted Russian mobility, forcing them to stay in the trenches. In a series of fierce engagements, Commonwealth forces gradually overran the Russian field fortifications, and the siege reached its final stages by late September. On the 28th of September 1633, Commonwealth forces took the main Russian supply points, and by the 4th of October the siege had broken. Shane's army retreated to its main camp, which was in turn surrounded by Commonwealth forces in mid-October. The besieged Russians waited for relief, but none arrived, as Commonwealth and Cossack cavalry had been sent to disrupt the Russian rear. Some historians also cite dissent and internal divisions in the Russian camp as responsible for their inaction and ineffectiveness. The Tatar invasion threatening the South Russian borderlands was a contributory factor, with many soldiers and boyars from those regions deserting the Russian camp to return to protect their homeland. Some foreign mercenaries also deserted to the Commonwealth side. Shine began surrender negotiations in January 1634, and by February they were in full swing. The Russians finally signed a surrender treaty on the 25th of February 1634, and on the 1st of March they vacated the camp. Under the surrender terms, the Russians had to leave behind most of their artillery but were allowed to retain the banners after a ceremony in which they were laid before King Vladislav. They also had to promise not to engage Commonwealth forces for the next 3 months. Shane's forces numbered around 12,000 at the time of the capitulation, but over 4,000, including most of the foreign contingent, immediately decided to defect to the Commonwealth. Other engagements. Several other towns and fortresses in the region were the site of smaller battles. Russian forces captured several significant locations during their advance in 1632, but Nagielski speculates that the delay in the arrival of the main force and artillery at Smolensk caused by this dilution of effort may have cost them the siege and consequently the war. In July 1633, the Russians took the towns of Polotsk, Velip, USVYAT, and Ozyrishchi. Polotsk was the scene of particularly heavy fighting as the Russians captured the city and part of the fortress. However, attacks on Vitebsk and Mścislaw were successfully repulsed. Polish forces laid siege to Putyvl, but due to the desertion of their Cossack allies they were forced to withdraw. In the autumn of 1633, Commonwealth forces retook Dorogobuzh, an important Russian supply point after its capture the year before. This setback wrecked Russian plans to send reinforcements to Shane's army, although in any event the Russians did not begin to gather a 5,000-strong army for that purpose until January 1634. Also that autumn, Grand Crown Hetman Stanislaw Konispolski defeated an Ottoman incursion in the south of the Commonwealth, freeing his force to lay siege to the Russian town of Sesk. Although Konispolski failed to take the fortress, he tied down large Russian forces, preventing them from moving north towards Smolensk. After the relief of Smolensk in the spring of 1634, the Commonwealth army moved towards the fortress Belaya. However, the siege of Belaya turned to a fiasco although the king managed to capture Vyazma. Treaty of Polyanovka. By the spring of 1634, the Russians had not only lost Shane's army but were threatened by Tatar raids that ravaged southern Russia. Patriarch Filaret had died the previous year, and without him the war further lessened. Even before the end of 1633, Tsar Michael of Russia was considering how best to end the conflict. because he had once been elected Tsar of Russia and could realistically lay claim to the Russian throne. King Vladislav wanted to continue the war, or because the Polish-Swedish Treaty of Polyanovka would soon be expiring, ally with the Russians to strike against Sweden. However, the Sejm wanted no more conflict. As Stanislaw Lubienski, the Bishop of Plock, wrote 2 weeks after Shane's surrender, "Our happiness is in remaining within our borders, guaranteeing health and well-being." With neither side keen on prolonging the war, they began negotiating, not for an armistice but for eternal peace. Talks began on the 30th of April 1634, and the Treaty of Polyanovka was signed in May, putting an end to hostilities. The treaty confirmed the pre-war status quo, with Russia paying the large war indemnity, while Vladislav agreed to surrender his claim to the Russian throne and return the royal insignia to Moscow. Jashnaka notes that from the Russian perspective it was likely that Vladislav's abnegation of his claim was more important, in terms of the subsequent increase in internal stability, than the loss of disputed borderland. Despite not winning militarily, the Russians may have scored a diplomatic triumph. Other authors, such as Heli, support this interpretation. Aftermath. Already during the later stages of the war, when the Commonwealth army moved from Smolensk to Bely, a new threat began to loom on the southern borders, where the Ottoman Empire was massing an invasion force. Thus Vladislav began redirecting his reinforcements to that theatre. Later that year, the Commonwealth forces under Stanislaw Koniecpolski scored a victory in the south, ending a war against the Ottomans. Both sides introduced new tactics, units and equipment based on Western models, but the Polish-Lithuanian forces proved more adept with these innovations than the Russians. However, the main factors that kept the Russians from winning were the delay in moving siege artillery to Smolensk and the severe disruption of Russian supply lines by Polish cavalry. A scapegoat was nevertheless needed. Mikhail Shine was accused of treason and, together with his second-in-command Artemy Izmailov and the latter's son Vasily, executed in Moscow on April 28, 1634. Learning from this defeat, the Russians would adopt new and more successful tactics in the Polish-Russian War. After the war, Vladislav gave the Russians the border town of Surpysk and nearby territories, hoping to persuade the Tsar to join in an anti-Swedish alliance. However, the king was ultimately unable to overcome objections from the Polish-Lithuanian Sejm, who were unwilling to fight Sweden after the Treaty of Smolensk. The Russians, unable to see benefit in such an alliance, were also unenthusiastic, and the proposed alliance came to nothing. The war cost the Commonwealth treasury about 4,300,000 zlotys. The Battle of Smolensk is commemorated on the tomb of the unknown soldier, Warsaw, with the inscription Smolensk 18x 163225E 1634.